You know, there are places you walk into where you can just feel the judgment in the air, thick and heavy like the heat of a Melbourne afternoon in January. Aura Architects was exactly that kind of place. It wasn't really an office. It was more like a temple of glass, steel, and carefully polished egos. Everything was minimalist, clean, and cold, from the Italian leather chairs to the smiles of the people who worked there. I remember the day Charlie Jones walked in. The entire space, which had been buzzing with important whispers, suddenly fell silent. All that was left was the clicking of expensive heels on the polished concrete floor, and then a steady, solid thump, thump, thump of a pair of old, worn-in Blundstone boots that had seen more than their fair share of red outback dust. Charlie stood there, an Indigenous man in his 40s, tall and sturdy like an old gum tree. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, his salt and pepper hair tied back neatly. In his hand wasn't a designer leather briefcase, but a well-worn, leather-bound sketchbook, its corners frayed. He was silent, his eyes observing everything with a stillness one can only learn from the land, from wide-open spaces, not from these concrete walls. And then Chloe Vance glided over. Chloe was a work of art, a masterpiece of calculated perfection. A sleek blonde bob, a tailored power dress from some designer in Paris, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was the star of Aura, the senior design lead, and she made sure everyone knew it. "Ah, you must be Charlie." Her voice was sweet as honey, but carried a cold sting. "Welcome to Aura. We're so ... delighted to have you join us as part of our diversity and inclusion initiative." The way she emphasized the word diversity made it sound more like an insult than a welcome. Charlie just nodded, a slow, deliberate nod. "Thank you." His voice was deep and warm. Chloe ignored the hand Charlie had extended for a shake. Instead, she pointed to a desolate corner right next to the noisy print room. "We've set you up over there. You'll have a great view of the photocopier." A few stifled snickers came from the nearby desks. Charlie said nothing, simply walking to his assigned desk. He placed his leather sketchbook down, a warm, organic object in a cold sea of technology. He didn't seem offended or angry. He was simply ... there. But one person saw it all. In another corner, Liam O'Connell, an old architect in a worn tweed jacket and thick glasses, had watched the entire charade. Liam was a retired legend who had built Aura's reputation in the early days with real talent, not with Instagram-worthy platitudes. He despised the firm's new culture. He looked at Charlie, then at Chloe, and sighed. A moment later, Chloe brought over a stack of old blueprints, drawings from a failed project, and dropped them on Charlie's desk with a thud. "If you could just go through these and organize them by date, Charlie. Something simple to get you started." She turned away, a triumphant smirk on her face. Charlie began flipping through the pages. It was a shopping center design with a critical structural flaw, a tensile stress issue that everyone had deemed unfixable. He looked at it for a long moment, then quietly opened his leather sketchbook. He didn't write anything. Instead, his calloused hand began to sketch, fast and precise. He drew a support beam system, not with straight lines and angles, but with organic curves that mimicked the root structure of a Moreton Bay fig tree clinging to a rock face. A solution that was both breathtakingly beautiful and ruthlessly intelligent. He didn't draw it on the company's blueprint, only in his own book for his own eyes. Liam, for some reason, happened to walk past at that exact moment. He glanced over Charlie's shoulder and froze. His eyes widened behind his thick glasses. He wasn't looking at the drawing. He was looking at the philosophy behind it, that root structure. It was identical to a solution that an anonymous architect, under the pseudonym Koa, had proposed on an international forum years ago to solve a famous engineering problem. A solution the entire world had admired, but whose author remained a mystery. Liam looked at Charlie's hands, then at his serene face. His heart began to beat faster. It couldn't be. Just a coincidence. He told himself that, but deep down, a huge question had begun to form, a question that could shake the very foundations of this proud temple. Honestly, the days that followed at Aura were worse than the silence of the first day. The feeling, it wasn't a punch to the face. It was 1,000 tiny pinpricks, slow and cruel, that dug into your skin every single day. Day after day at Aura, Charlie became a shadow. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave, yet he seemed to be invisible to everyone, unless they needed something done that nobody else wanted to do. "Charlie, darling, could you be a dear and help us get coffee for the clients? Just pitching in." Chloe's voice was always that sweet, especially in front of others. And so, while the young architects were busy discussing million-dollar ideas, Charlie would be meticulously taking down complex orders. 1 soy latte with no sugar, 1 skinny flat white, and 1 macchiato with just a drop of almond milk. He did it without a word of complaint. He would quietly place the fragrant cups on the table, receiving only half-hearted nods or worse. The silence of being completely unseen. The most sophisticated humiliation happened during the creative meetings, or more accurately, Chloe's ego shows. The team was stuck on a design for a community library. Charlie, after days of silent observation, timidly spoke up. "I think," his voice was warm and deep, "we could design the main space to follow. A dry riverbed. A place where people can gather in the riverbed, while the books line the banks, creating a feeling of being enveloped by knowledge." As soon as he finished, the room fell silent. Chloe put down her pen, a smile on her face that everyone knew was fake. "That's a sweet thought, Charlie. Thank you for your contribution. But we're looking for market-driven, disruptive solutions here, not campfire stories." There were those snickers again. Campfire stories. Another jab aimed at his heritage. Charlie said nothing more, just quietly retreated into himself. His gaze drifted out the window, far away. In his mind wasn't anger, but the words of his father, echoing from decades ago as they sat by a river in Arnhem Land. "Patience is not waiting, my son. It is watching. You see, the river never fights the rock. It simply finds a way to flow around it." And Charlie, like the river, let Chloe's insults flow past him. But there was one rock that Chloe's entire team couldn't get around. It was the Canberra Civic Center project, specifically the ventilation system for a massive auditorium. Every solution they proposed was too expensive, too complex, or ruined the building's aesthetic. The pressure mounted. Chloe became more irritable, her perfect facade beginning to crack. While the whole office spun in desperation, Charlie was spending hours in the dusty archives where Chloe had sent him to reorganize old project files. He sat there amongst the old stacks of paper and he drew. He wasn't drawing skyscrapers. He was drawing things from memory, the bark of a tree, the veins of a stone, and the giant termite mounds of Litchfield. And then it came to him. An idea sparked. The termite mound, a marvel of natural air conditioning. He immediately sketched a ventilation system that mimicked the complex tunnel structure inside a termite mound, using natural convection currents to cool the entire space without powerful air conditioners. A solution that was brilliant, elegant, and almost cost-free. That afternoon, Chloe walked past Charlie's desk, her face tense with pressure. She had just had a terrible call with the client. Her eyes accidentally swept over Charlie's open sketchbook. She stopped short. On the page was a detailed, strangely beautiful drawing. She didn't understand the philosophy behind it, didn't know where it came from, but she instantly recognized the shape of a solution. "Oh, what's this, Charlie?" Chloe walked over, her voice feigning curiosity. "Looks interesting. Let me see." Before Charlie could react, she had picked up the sketchbook. Her eyes lit up. This was it. Her way out. Her mind raced. He's just a draftsman. He wouldn't know what to do with this. It would be wasted. In my hands, it could save the whole project. This is for the good of the company. With that thought, she closed the sketchbook, smiled at Charlie. "Thank you. I'll study this further." And she turned and walked away, carrying his masterpiece as if it were a trinket she'd just found. Charlie sat there, watching her back as she retreated. This time, there was no river-like stillness in his eyes. There was something else. A profound disappointment. And then he slowly folded his hands on his desk, his calloused fingers interlacing. His silence was no longer patience. It was waiting. Waiting for the coming storm. You know, after that whole ventilation idea incident, Chloe's career took off. She was hailed as the hero who saved the Canberra project, the creative mind of Aura. But while the whole office celebrated, Liam O'Connell felt something was so wrong. It turned his stomach. He'd been in this industry for 40 years. He knew the smell of real talent, and it didn't smell like Chloe's expensive perfume. Real talent smelled of burnt coffee, sleepless nights, and a humble obsession. For Liam, Koa, that anonymous architect, was a true artist. He had followed Koa's work for years, marveling at how the man blended nature with engineering, creating structures that weren't just for living in, but for feeling. And now, a piece of Koa's soul was attached to the name Chloe Vance, to Liam. That was a sacrilege, so he began his own quiet investigation. Every evening, after Chloe and her sycophantic crowd had left, Liam would sneak over to the bin next to Charlie's desk. He'd pick out the crumpled pieces of paper, the unfinished sketches Charlie had thrown away. He'd take them back to his office and carefully smooth them out. And under the lamplight, a world revealed itself. They weren't just architectural drawings. They were studies of nature, the way a fern frond uncurls, the structure of a spiderweb in the dew, the fracture lines on a piece of sandstone. The more he looked, the more he saw an incredible consistency, a profound design philosophy that no school could ever teach. He pulled up Charlie's personnel file. It was suspiciously empty. Draftsman, various firms, Northern Territory. No prestigious universities, no awards, nothing. A mysterious brick wall. Liam decided to try a more direct approach. One morning, he brought 2 cups of coffee to Charlie's desk. "Care for a cuppa, mate?" Charlie looked up, a little surprised, but then nodded. Liam sat down, pretending to be casual. That ventilation solution. It reminded me of something I read once, a paper on biomimicry. Liam looked straight into Charlie's eyes, searching for a sign. Charlie just smiled gently, a smile that deepened the wrinkles around his eyes. Sometimes the old ways are the best. Mr. O'Connell, the termites knew how to cool their homes millions of years before we had a concept of air conditioning. His voice held not a hint of pride, just a simple statement of fact. It was a perfect answer, both humble and wise, and it gave nothing away. Liam knew he wasn't going to get this man to talk. Just then, the big news dropped. Aura Architects had won the bid for the project of the century, Horizon Tower, a complex that would redefine the entire Melbourne skyline. This was the firm's last chance to re-establish its dominance or sink into obscurity forever. The pressure was immense. And of course, Chloe Vance was tasked with leading the project. But what her team produced were soulless glass boxes, boring replicas of buildings in Dubai or Shanghai, completely devoid of an Australian soul. They were stuck. Desperation began to creep through the polished hallways. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. He sat in his home library, surrounded by stacks of architectural books and magazines. He was flipping through a specialized Italian journal from years ago, a special issue on anonymous talents. And then he read a deep analysis of Koa. The article mentioned that Koa's greatest inspiration came from a small, little-known community project he had participated in as a young man, a project that had taught him about the power of architecture to heal and connect people. The article named the project the Maningrida Community Center. Maningrida, a remote indigenous community in the Northern Territory. Liam's heart stopped. He rushed to his filing cabinet, his hands trembling as he pulled out Charlie Jones' file. He scanned the blurry text, and then he saw it, a single line at the bottom of the page. Project Assistant, Maningrida Community Center, 2008. The two pieces of the puzzle clicked together perfectly. Liam leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. The feeling wasn't triumph. It was a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. His suspicion was no longer a guess. It was a fact. The quiet man the entire firm was treating like an invisible nobody, the man organizing papers in the corner, was one of the greatest architectural minds of his generation. Liam looked out the window at the sparkling city lights. He knew the real storm was just beginning. And this time, he wouldn't just stand by and watch. Asterisk T has to be said. Nothing exposes incompetence more clearly than immense pressure. The Horizon Tower project was like a giant magnifying glass, focusing on the hollowness of the team led by Chloe. What they created, after weeks of agonizing work, were soulless glass boxes, glamorous but heartless replicas. You could place them in any city in the world, and no one would know the difference. The atmosphere in the office grew thick, more suffocating than ever. Chloe, no longer able to maintain her perfect facade, became frantic. She blamed everyone, from the junior architects to the engineering team. Her tyranny created a toxic work environment where no one dared to be creative for fear of making a mistake. They just followed orders, and the result was a design that was safe to the point of being boring. Charlie saw it all. He saw the desperation in the young people's eyes, saw the waste of a golden opportunity to create something truly meaningful for the city. And he decided he couldn't just stand by and watch any more. So, as night fell, when Aura Architects became a tomb of unfulfilled ambitions, Charlie began his real work. He didn't sit at his cramped desk by the print room. He went to the largest boardroom, the one with the long wooden table and glass walls overlooking the sparkling city. He didn't turn on the bright overhead lights. He used a single, small desk lamp, creating a warm pool of light in the darkness, and he didn't use a computer. He rolled out giant sheets of paper on the floor, knelt, and used sticks of charcoal. His hands, calloused from years of work, were now stained black. He wasn't drawing. He was conversing with the paper. He was conversing with the land where the tower would be built. In his mind weren't figures of profit or the praise of critics. He was thinking of the Wurundjeri people, the first custodians of this land. He thought of the creeks and rivers that once flowed where there were now concrete roads. He wanted this tower not to be an invader, but a return. He wanted it to grow from the earth, like a tree, a part of this place. And the masterpiece began to take shape. A tower with a gently twisting structure, mimicking the trunk of an ancient river rat gum. Its outer skin wasn't dead glass, but a system of kinetic panels that could move, shimmering in the sun like eucalyptus leaves in the wind, while self-regulating to optimize light and temperature. The base of the tower wasn't a cold concrete block, but fanned out into public plazas, small gardens and walkways, weaving into the city like a giant root system, nourishing community life. It wasn't a building. It was a living organism. That night, Mia, the young architect who had always felt a quiet injustice for Charlie, came back to the office to retrieve a scarf she'd forgotten. She had stayed late, terrified of the pressure Chloe was creating. As she passed the main boardroom, she saw a sliver of light from under the door. Curious, she peeked inside, and she held her breath. Before her was a sight she would never forget. Charlie, the quiet man everyone ordered around, was kneeling in the middle of a field of blueprints, his entire being radiating an aura of absolute focus and passion. And on those papers was a creation so beautiful it was surreal. It made everything she had ever learned, ever seen, feel small. She unconsciously pushed the door open. The soft creak made Charlie look up. Their eyes met for a moment. Charlie wasn't angry or startled. His eyes were calm. He saw the pure, unadulterated wonder in Mia's eyes, not a trace of the judgment or jealousy he saw in others. Mia stepped inside, her voice a trembling whisper. What is this, Mr. Jones? It's unbelievable. Charlie looked down at his work, then at her, a rare smile gracing his lips. This is what the land wants to be. That one sentence was enough to bring tears to Mia's eyes. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Charlie nodded. He had an ally. 2 days later, disaster struck. In the final preliminary review, the powerful client, an investor known for his sharp taste, flatly rejected Chloe's design. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice ringing with utter disappointment. This thing has no soul. It could be built anywhere in the world. We are building in Melbourne, Miss Vance, not a copy of some other place. Every word was a slap in Chloe's face. The meeting ended in humiliation. The deadline to present to the global CEO was just 2 days away. They had nothing. Panic gripped Aura. This time, no fake smile could hide the truth. Their proud ship was sinking. And in the darkness of that desperation, a masterpiece lay silent, waiting for its moment. The fateful day finally arrived. I swear to you, the atmosphere in Aura's grand boardroom that day didn't feel like a presentation. It felt more like a judgment room. Everything was deathly still, so quiet you could hear your own heart beating in your chest. At the head of the long wooden table sat Mr. Alistair Finch, the global CEO from London. He was an impeccably dressed Englishman, but his eyes were as cold and sharp as a razor. He didn't say much, just sat there, observing in silence, and it was that silence that was the most terrifying thing, like the stillness of an alpha wolf before it decides on its prey. Next to him sat the client, his face a clear mask of skepticism and boredom. It seemed he was only there as a final courtesy. Then Chloe walked in, followed by her team, their faces as pale as if they were facing a firing squad. But Chloe was different. She wore her confidence like a suit of armor. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her power dress immaculate, and her smile radiant. But if you looked closely, really closely, you could see the slightest tremor in the hand that held the laser pointer, an almost imperceptible shake. In a corner of the room, Liam O'Connell sat quietly, separate from the others, his face unreadable. And Charlie, you know where he was? He was assigned to a tiny lectern in the corner, next to the laptop connected to the projector. His role today, in the most important meeting in the company's history, was to click the slides. Before starting, Chloe glided past Charlie's station. She didn't even look at him, just let out a whisper loud enough for him to hear. Just click the button when I nod, Charlie. Don't touch anything else. It was a final knife twist, an unnecessary assertion of power that stemmed from her own profound insecurity. Charlie didn't reply, just gave a slight nod. His gaze was calm. Deep. Chloe began her presentation. Her voice rang out, professional and well-rehearsed, but completely soulless. She talked about design synergy, about iconic solutions, about space optimization. The empty jargon echoed in the deathly silence of the room. On the large screen, the image of the boring glass box appeared, looking pathetic and out of place. While Chloe spoke, Mr. Finch didn't look at the screen. He looked down at his notepad, tapping his expensive Mont Blanc pen on the page. Tap ... Each sound, steady and dry, cut through the space like the ticking of a time bomb. The client leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Liam didn't look at Chloe or the screen. His eyes were fixed on Charlie in the corner. As for Charlie, he stood there, back straight, eyes forward, his hand resting on the mouse. Each time Chloe nodded, he clicked with a decisive and precise motion. He didn't look worried or angry. He looked like a hunter, waiting patiently in the bush, completely at one with his surroundings, waiting for the right moment to act. And with this design, Chloe finished her speech with a grand, hollow statement. We believe Horizon Tower will be not just a building, but a new icon for Melbourne. She smiled, a radiant but empty smile. The final image of the soulless glass box hung on the screen. And then an absolute silence fell. Heavy, tangible, so much so that you could feel its weight pressing down on your shoulders. Mr. Finch's tapping pen stopped. He slowly raised his head, his ice-cold eyes looking directly at Chloe. The whole room held its breath. waiting for the final verdict. Asterisk, that silence, it stretched on for an eternity. An entire universe of failure and humiliation was packed into 10 silent seconds. Finally, Mr. Finch spoke, and his voice, though not loud, carried the weight of a boulder dropping into a still lake. "Miss Vance," he began, his eyes still locked on Chloe, "thank you for your presentation. But I must be direct. What you have just presented is not a vision. It is an insult." The word insult was uttered coldly, precisely, without a trace of emotion. Chloe froze, the smile on her lips freezing and then shattering. "It's an insult to this city," Finch continued. "It's an insult to our client, and it's an insult to the intelligence of everyone in this room. It demonstrates laziness, a lack of imagination, and worst of all, the arrogance to think that this is good enough. Aura does not pay you for good enough." Every word was like a hammer blow, nailing the coffin of Chloe's career shut. She stammered, "Mr. Finch, sir, we worked very hard, ... "No," Finch interrupted. "You were busy. You were not working. There is a significant difference." He leaned back, a gesture of finality. "I think we are done here. It was a death sentence." The air was sucked out of the room. Chloe's team bowed their heads while she just stood there, her face as white as a sheet. But just at that moment of absolute despair, a calm, steady voice rose from the back of the room. "Mr. Finch, excuse me. If I may, I believe we have another option." It was Liam O'Connell. He stood up, his posture unwavering. Chloe spun around, her eyes blazing with fury. "Liam, what the hell are you doing? Be quiet." But Liam ignored her. He looked towards Mia, the young architect sitting nearby, and gave a slight nod. It was a prearranged signal. Mia, though her hands were trembling, took a deep breath, stood up, and walked to the lectern where Charlie was standing. She pulled out a small USB stick and plugged it into the laptop. Chloe screamed, "What are you doing? Get away from there now." But it was too late. On the large screen, the image of Chloe's soulless glass box vanished. In its place, a masterpiece began to appear, line by line. The entire room held its breath. Horizon Tower appeared, not as a concrete block, but as a living thing. It rose from the ground like a giant tree, its skin shimmering like leaves in the sun, its base spreading out to connect with the surrounding parks and plazas. It was modern yet wild, powerful yet elegant. It was Melbourne. It was Australia. The client, who had been leaning back in boredom the whole time, now lunged forward, his hands flat on the table, his eyes glued to the screen. "My God, ... He breathed, What is this? It's perfect." But Chloe, in her panic, shrieked madly, "What is that? Who authorized this? This is just some scribbles from a draftsman. It's worthless. You're wrong, Miss Vance." Alistair Finch's voice rang out again, but this time it was no longer cold. It held something else, excitement, admiration. He stood up and walked towards the screen, his eyes never leaving the design. "These aren't scribbles. This is genius." He turned back to face Chloe, a mysterious smile playing on his lips. "Head office in London has been chasing this particular architect for 5 years. Someone known only by the pseudonym Koa. We made multi-million-dollar offers, but he always refused." The room was dead silent, trying to process what they were hearing. Chloe looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Finch continued, his voice now like a final hammer blow, shattering Chloe's world into a million pieces. We couldn't buy him. So we did something else. We acquired his entire small company, a shell company he used to work in secret. We didn't just hire Charlie Jones, Miss Vance. He paused for a second to let his words sink in. We brought him here under a disguise to see if this company, these people, were worth saving. He is not here to click slides for you. He is here to decide if you are worthy of working for him. A stunned silence enveloped the room. You could have heard a pin drop. Chloe staggered back a step, her hands flying to her head, unable to speak. All her pride, her condescension, the career she had built, all of it crumbled in less than 30 seconds. The client was ecstatic, turning to his assistant and talking non-stop. The members of Chloe's team looked from Charlie to each other, their faces a mixture of shame, guilt, and utter astonishment. And Charlie, he said nothing. He just quietly walked out from his small corner, the one where he had been imprisoned for so long. He walked calmly to the head of the table where Alistair Finch was standing. He didn't look at Chloe, didn't look at the people who had once scorned him. His eyes were focused only on his creation, his spiritual child, shining brilliantly. On the screen, he had reclaimed his space, not with a single word, but with his own undeniable talent. The room seemed to have run out of air. Alistair Finch's declaration still hung there, heavy and unbelievable. And at the center of that stunned silence was Chloe Vance. You know, there are moments in life when the entire world you've painstakingly built, the entire person you believed yourself to be, shatters right before your eyes. This was that moment for Chloe. Her face was ashen, her lips moved, but no sound came out. A storm raged in her mind. Koa? Charlie is Koa? That quiet old countryman. In the old clothes is Koa. Every memory returned to torment her. The way she'd ignored his handshake, the way she'd sent him for coffee, the way she'd thrown garbage work at him, and worst of all, the way she had arrogantly stolen his idea and thought she was so clever. The truth didn't just humiliate her. It stripped her bare, revealing her not just as talentless, but as a fool. An arrogant fool. She stumbled, trying to gather her things from the table, her expensive fountain pen, her leather-bound notebook, but her shaking hands betrayed her. The pen fell to the floor, making a dry, pathetic clatter in the silence. That sound was a full stop. Without a word, Chloe turned and practically fled from the boardroom, not daring to look at anyone. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving behind the ashes of a career that had just been incinerated. Once the shadow of arrogance had vanished, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The client, who had been so bored just moments before, was now buzzing with energy. He walked right up to Charlie, his eyes shining, pointing at the design on the screen. "This is incredible, Mr. Koa. This kinetic facade, what principle does it operate on? And the timber in the main lobby, is that recycled Jarrah from Western Australia? I've always believed." He spoke passionately, firing off a series of questions about engineering, materials, and philosophy. It was absolute and immediate recognition from someone who truly knew its value. Liam O'Connell quietly walked over to Charlie's side. He said nothing, just placed a hand on the shoulder of the man he had secretly admired. A light pat that conveyed everything: respect, admiration, and a silent apology for what Charlie had endured. In the corner, Mia had started to cry, but they were tears of relief and joy. She looked at Charlie as if he were a living saint. Mr. Finch smiled, a genuine smile. "Charlie, perhaps now you should say a few words." Charlie stepped forward to the head of the table, the spot where Chloe had stood just minutes earlier. But unlike Chloe, he didn't look at numbers or charts. His gaze was distant, as if he were looking through the glass walls to the very land below. "Thank you, sir," he began, his voice deep and steady. "Before we talk about steel and glass, I want us to talk about the land. My grandmother, a tribal elder, used to teach me, we do not own the land. We belong to it. If you listen, the land will tell you what it needs." He paused, letting his words sink in for everyone. "This tower," he pointed to the screen, "is that listening. It listens to the sun to provide shade. It listens to the wind to cool itself. And it listens to the flow of people to open up community spaces. It is not my creation. It is the land's answer." His words were not a presentation. They were a poem, a sermon on respect and connection. It made Chloe's empty jargon from before seem utterly shameful. The room was silent, but this time it was a silence of admiration and contemplation. Everyone finally understood. They weren't just looking at a genius architect. They were in the presence of a man of profound wisdom. Mr. Finch nodded, completely convinced. He turned to Charlie, his tone no longer that of a commanding CEO, but of a partner seeking consultation. "So, Mr. Jones, or should I say Koa, what is your first step?" Charlie looked around the room at the faces looking up at him, and then he smiled, a gentle and slightly mischievous smile. "First step?" he said. "I think we should get a better coffee machine. Then we get to work." The room broke into laughter, a light and warm laughter that washed away all the tension. The reversal was complete. But this wasn't revenge. This was a new beginning, built on a foundation of truth and respect. Asterisk, 6 months later. If you were to walk into the offices of Aura Architects now, you probably wouldn't recognize the place. They were the same glass walls, the same million-dollar view of the city, but the cold, tense atmosphere was gone. In its place was a warm, vibrant buzz. Sketches were pinned all over the walls, green ferns were placed everywhere, and in the corner, a top-of-the-line Italian coffee machine was working overtime, filling the air with a pleasant aroma. Charlie had kept his promise. People talked to each other, laughed with each other. They debated ideas with passion, not fear. They were no longer a collection of individual egos. They had become a team. Charlie didn't sit in a glamorous director's office. His desk was right in the middle of the open plan space, always covered in rolls of paper, and anyone, from an intern to a senior architect, could walk up and ask him a question. And Chloe? She had vanished from Melbourne's glamorous architectural world. No one knew where she had gone. But then one morning, a letter arrived for Charlie. It had no return address, just a postmark from a very remote area in Western Australia. Charlie opened it. The letter was short, the handwriting a bit shaky. "Dear Mr. Jones," it read, "I'm not writing this to apologize, because my apologies are worthless. I just wanted you to know that I've left the industry. I'm volunteering for an organization that builds houses in remote communities. Every day, I'm learning how to hold a hammer, how to mix mortar. And for the first time in my life, I feel like a building has a soul. Thank you, not for teaching me a lesson about my career, but for teaching me a lesson about life." Charlie finished reading, slowly folded the letter, and put it in his drawer. He didn't tell anyone about it. A small, peaceful smile played on his lips. Forgiveness sometimes doesn't need to be spoken aloud. That afternoon, Charlie took Mia to the construction site of Horizon Tower. The tower had now risen from the ground, its foundation and first few floors taking shape, a giant sturdy steel skeleton against the sky. They stood on the concrete foundation, looking up at the work in progress. The wind whistled through the beams, creating a symphony of creation. "Do you see, Mia?" Charlie said, his voice warm. "The most beautiful part of a building isn't its sparkling spire, but the foundation buried deep in the earth. If the foundation isn't strong, everything above it is meaningless." He looked at the young architect, the one who had believed in him from the early days. Then he took his old, battered leather sketchbook from his bag, the book that had been with him for so many years, that held so many ideas. He gave it to Mia. "My journey with this book is over. Now it's your turn to fill it." Mia was stunned, her hands trembling as she took the book. "Be you to Mr. Jones. This is your whole world," Charlie smiled. "An empty sketchbook is always better than a full one, kid. It means anything is possible." They stood there, the mentor and the student, one generation passing a legacy on to the next. They looked up together at the great structure taking shape in the brilliant orange light of the Melbourne sunset. Charlie's story wasn't just about a reversal of fortune at the office. It was a story about foundations. The foundation of a building and the foundation of a human heart. It teaches us that sometimes the greatest value, the most brilliant talent, is hidden beneath a humble, simple exterior. And only when we learn to see past the shells of prejudice can we see true beauty. And just like Horizon Tower, once built on a foundation of respect, anything can reach for the sky. The story of Charlie Jones, though dramatic, leaves us with a gentle yet profound lesson about a person's true worth. In a life that is often noisy and rushed, we can easily judge others by their external labels, by the clothes they wear, the titles they hold, or their perceived status in society. But this story reminds us that true gold fears no fire. A person's core value is not found in those flashy things, but in the talent, dignity, and integrity they quietly cultivate every day. Charlie's calmness in the face of contempt was not weakness. It was the strength of someone who understood his own worth. He didn't need to argue because he knew that a long road tests a horse's strength, and that his work, his masterpiece, would eventually speak for itself. At the same time, the story is a clear reminder of the principle that you reap what you sow. Chloe's arrogance and prejudice, though masked by a professional facade, ultimately became her own undoing. It shows that building one's self-worth on the disrespect of others is to build on a weak foundation, one destined to crumble. Perhaps the deepest lesson is the role each of us can play. Any of us can be Charlie, working quietly and holding on to our dignity. But more importantly, we can choose to be a Liam O'Connell, someone who dares to look deeper, who dares to believe in the good hidden behind a simple exterior, and who dares to stand up for what is right. Breaking that toxic silence sometimes only requires a look of trust, a word of encouragement, or an act of defending fairness. That is the true power that can change an entire environment and even a life. Asterisk. How did this story touch you? Have you ever felt unfairly judged based on your perceived value, or have you ever witnessed such a spectacular reversal of fortune in your own life? Please share your feelings and your own stories in the comments section below. Every share helps build a more understanding and compassionate community. If this story gave you a valuable moment of reflection, please don't hesitate to hit the like button to support us. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more dramatic and profound stories like this one in the future. Thank you for listening. We wish you a very peaceful day and hope that you always hold firm to your own value, no matter how noisy or chaotic the world outside may be. Because after all, the brightest light often comes from the most unexpected of places.